Welcome to Ripple Edge, where we cut through the noise and give you the real picture on XRP. Let's get into it. The US government just found its kill switch for the debt crisis, and it runs directly through stablecoins and the XRP ledger. If you think that sounds like a bold claim, give me 4 minutes and I will show you the receipts. Nos, says, this. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now because this kind of breakdown is what we do every single time. And now because das here is where we start. Fed Chair nominee Kevin Worsh just sat in front of Congress and said it out loud. Digital assets are already part of the fabric of the U.S. financial services industry. Not coming. Not theoretical. Already embedded. When the man who is about to run monetary policy for the most powerful economy on earth says crypto is baked in, you do not dismiss that. You map out what it means for your portfolio. Now here is what nobody is connecting. That statement from Worsh does not exist in isolation. It sits inside a much larger architecture that the U.S. Treasury has been quietly assembling, and the Genius Act is the foundation. The Genius Act was designed to create a clear regulatory framework for stable coins. Banks saw what that meant immediately. If stable coins can offer yield and compete for deposits, trillions of dollars start moving away from traditional banking. So the banks went to work. They found a backdoor through the Clarity Act, trying to rewrite language that would gut the competitive edge stablecoins were about to have. Trump went directly to Truth Social and said the Genius Act is being undermined by the banks, and that is unacceptable. His words, not mine. He called it a threat to America's crypto agenda and said if the U.S. does not move, that edge goes to China and other countries. That is a president publicly naming banks as obstacles to digital asset progress. That is not a small thing. But here is the edge most people are completely missing. This is not really a crypto story. This is a debt story. Former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, the man who steered the U.S. through 2008, came out recently and said a debt crisis is coming that will make the last one look manageable. His exact framing: when the Fed becomes the only buyer of treasuries and yields keep rising, the system breaks. And unlike 2008, the government will not have the fiscal firepower to bail itself out. He is right about the problem. Here is what he may not have factored in yet. The numbers on the debt are not abstract anymore. In 2024, the U.S. sat at roughly $36 trillion in debt. We are now at $39 trillion. That is $3 trillion added in under 2 years. Since 2000, Equalfortke, Biscaisen Estians, Esain Erkesneyaverchase and Seychwaros, Lesvin, the debt has increased by more than 160%, going from under $15 trillion to where we sit today. And we already know from Trump's own budget signals that another $7 trillion is likely coming when you factor in defense spending commitments. The traditional playbook for managing that kind of debt load requires buyers, foreign nations buying treasuries. The problem is that foreign demand has been softening for years. Countries are quietly diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets. So who steps in? This is where Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent handed us the answer in plain sight. Bessent has publicly framed stablecoins as a uniquely efficient channel for boosting Treasury demand. The Genius Act in his own framing is structured to channel stablecoin inflows directly into government debt. Read that again slowly. Every dollar sitting inside a US dollar-backed stablecoin has to be backed by something. That something is US Treasuries. So the more stablecoin adoption grows globally, the more Treasury demand grows automatically. It is a self-reinforcing loop that solves the buyer problem without the Fed having to print its way out. What Here's the data point that stops most people cold. Stablecoin issuers and tokenized U.S. Treasury platforms currently hold over $170 billion in U.S. Treasuries. That already puts them ahead of Saudi Arabia, ahead of South Korea, ahead of Germany as Treasury holders. And the stablecoin market is still in early innings. The top 2 stablecoins alone, Tether at over $188 billion in circulation and USDC behind it, are almost entirely dollar-backed. That is hundreds of billions of dollars in Treasury demand that did not exist a decade ago and is now growing faster than any traditional sovereign buyer. Now, here is where XRP and Ripple enter this picture in a way the broader market has not fully priced in. The XRP ledger currently hosts 7 stable coins. Most of them are US dollar-backed. RLUSD, Ripple's own stablecoin, is regulated, transparent, and issued by a company that is now one of the most institutionally credible players in the entire crypto space. Ripple has been through the SEC fight. They came out the other side with regulatory clarity that most crypto companies still do not have. When the US government starts handing infrastructure keys to stablecoin issuers, they are not handing them to anonymous protocols. They are handing them to compliant, regulated, battle-tested entities. Ripple fits that profile more cleanly than almost anyone in this space. USDC is also on the XRP ledger, so you have two of the most credible dollar-backed stablecoins sitting on the same settlement layer. That is not an accident. That is institutional signal. When the goal is to use stablecoins as a continuous buyer of US debt, the underlying network needs to be fast, cheap, and reliable at scale. The XRP ledger clears transactions in 3 to 5 seconds with near zero fees. That is the infrastructure argument that does not get made loudly enough. Now pull this back to the chart level for a second because the visual here is worth understanding. Look at the stablecoin market share breakdown. USD-denominated stablecoins dominate overwhelmingly. But zoom out and you will see the competitive pressure starting to build at the edges. Coinbase just listed TGBP, a British pound-backed stablecoin now available globally. The French finance minister has publicly called for more euro-denominated stablecoins and urged EU banks to explore tokenized deposits. The UK is moving its pound on-chain. Europe is mobilizing. Every non-dollar stablecoin that gains traction is a unit of Treasury demand that does not flow back to the US. That is the geopolitical math. The US is racing to lock in dollar dominance at the stablecoin layer before the euro, and the pound established their own footholds. That race is why Trump is naming banks publicly. That race is why Bessent is framing stablecoins as a treasury tool. That race is why Kevin Worsh walked into a congressional hearing and said crypto is already part of the financial system without flinching. Here is what the Fed governor said back in 2025, and it lines up with everything we just walked through. Stablecoins are key to America's payment future. They were not speaking loosely. That statement was infrastructure planning dressed up as an observation. So here's the real play, and this is the part your circle is probably not talking about yet. The US debt problem does not get solved by austerity. It does not get solved by cutting spending fast enough to matter. It gets solved by engineering a new class of perpetual treasury buyer at global scale. Stablecoins do exactly that. And the networks those stablecoins run on, specifically the XRP ledger, become load-bearing financial infrastructure for the US government's debt management strategy. That's us. That is not hype. That is the logical conclusion of the data we just walked through. Bessent's own words, the Genius Act structure, Ripple's regulatory positioning, and $170 billion already sitting in treasuries from stablecoin issuers. What you now know that most XRP holders are still piecing together, the debt crisis is real. The solution has already been engineered through stable coin demand. Ripple and the XRP ledger are positioned inside that solution by design, and the Genius Act is the legal architecture that makes it all run. Banks are fighting it because they see what it means for their deposit base. That fight is a signal, not a setback. That is the edge. Stay sharp, subscribe so you catch the next one before everyone else does.